act called the crime bill. Now, I must try to lay this out in just a moment. I want to thank in a special way the leader of the ACLU, who's sitting with us today, because no one has argued the case more forcefully and given more data and kept us abreast than Laura Murphy. Lee, give her a hand, would you please? Thank you. To Brother Smith and all of you who are gathered. When we use the term back in the civil rights days, that itself shows a slick spot on the brain. It is as if you've been disconnected from time and space back in the civil rights days. There is some assumption that these days of civil rights struggle have been suspended and are not yet upon us. The civil rights struggle, the racial justice struggle, the gender equality struggle continues. In biblical terms, that was a great celebration when David slew Goliath. But they didn't celebrate too long, because while they were glad that David beat Goliath, Goliath had sons, and the giants kept coming. So today we beat Jim Crow in the South, but Jim Crow Esquire keeps coming. And when Jim Crow was a wolf wearing wolf clothes, we were psychologically positioned to fight Jim Crow. But when Jim Crow goes to Yale or someplace and disguises his wolf instinct in sheep clothing, the Bible reminds us. When wolves come in sheep clothing, they are more deceptive. So if Bush says fast-track jobs in Mexico, we say no, we got to fight for our job. But if Clinton says NAFTA, we say, well, NAFTA that's a little different. It's the same thing. If Reagan had proposed a Howard Johnson 60 new flavors of killing plan, if Reagan had proposed $10 billion in new prison construction, while school systems in D.C. closed because of lack of capital improvement, and others should be closed for the same reason, there have been massive demonstrations. Reagan could not have put through this crime bill. Bush could not have put through this crime bill. It's a combination of Kool-Aid and cyanide. And those who try to trade Kool-Aid off from cyanide didn't read Jim Jones' story. You cannot make that distinction. This is a criminal act. I was in Lake Providence, Louisiana.
It does not matter that 96% of black women voted for Hillary Clinton. It does not matter that 96% of black women voted for Hillary Clinton.
For black women who we turned out, we know who we turned out for.
Black women voted 94% for Hillary Clinton.
Yes. And we know we had the betrayal of that 53%.
Meaning white women.
Meaning white women. That betrayal
you can go ahead and say it on
women.
a black show.
Yes, no, absolutely. Betrayal of white women, the 53% who turned out and voted for Donald Trump, and yet still showed up for our march.
Congress was passing harsh mandatory minimums for possession of small amounts of crack cocaine and other drugs, sentences harsher than murderers receive in some other Western democracies. And soon, Democrats began competing with Republicans to prove they could be even tougher on them than their Republican counterparts. And so it was President Bill Clinton who escalated the drug war far beyond what his Republican predecessors even dreamed possible. And it was President Clinton that championed laws denying federal financial aid to drug offenders for college. It was President Clinton who championed laws banning people with criminal convictions from access to public housing so that people wouldn't have housing upon release from prison. It was the Clinton administration that championed laws denying even food stamps under federal law to people who were once caught with drugs. To a large extent, the basic architecture of this new caste system was championed by a Democratic administration desperate to win back the so-called white swing voters, the folks who had defected from the Democratic Party in the wake of the civil rights movement. Still, in my experience, many people who are familiar with this history defend the drug war and mass incarceration nonetheless. They say, but what about all those drug kingpins, and what about the violence in our communities? Don't we need this war to deal with them? And it is true. We need an aggressive approach to dealing with the violence that plagues our communities. But let's be clear, this drug war has never been aimed at rooting out the drug kingpins or the most violent offenders. Never has.
Control and Law Enforcement Act.
We keep going. With respect to the crime bill, I think as more Americans focus on the fact that this bill would have put more police on the street, would have locked up violent offenders so they never could get out again, would have given more prison construction money available to the states and as well as the federal government, but also would have dealt with prevention, giving young people something to say yes to. It's a very well thought out crime bill that is both smart and tough. I think Americans are going to say, why these political games? Why are we once again letting certain special interests call the shots in Washington? And we will eventually get a good crime bill like the president has proposed. It'll just take a little longer than it should have.
Of color had never heard of Bernie Sanders. I had never heard of Bernie Sanders before the presidential election campaign. And, you know, the reality is that the Clintons are very well known to black folks in particular. And, you know, one of the reasons why I wrote my piece for The Nation is that although, you know, one side of the Clinton story is well known to black folks, the fact that, you know, Bill Clinton was really the first president that ever really embraced black people as human beings. You know, I think it's important when people, you know, talk about, lots of folks ask me, particularly white folks, ask me, you know, why do so many black folks support Clinton when he, you know, his policies were so disastrous for the African American community? And I think many people forget that, you know, we had centuries of slavery where no politician was responsive to our humanity at all, followed by Jim Crow segregation. And, you know, although Lyndon B. Johnson and Robert Kennedy and John Kennedy were allies in some respects, though not all respects, with the civil rights movement and African American communities, there had never been a president or a presidential candidate who actually treated black folks like they were real people who could be viewed and treated as human beings, you know, who weren't a problem to be solved, that didn't treat African Americans as a problem to be solved, but instead would actually sit down and eat with them and sing in their church and acted like they enjoyed, recognized us as human beings. And that's a huge thing. Just as the election of Barack Obama as the first black president was a huge thing for African Americans as a community, it was no small thing for Bill Clinton to reach out to African American communities in the way that he did. And I think many people remember that, especially older African Americans remember that. What they don't know, what they often don't know or don't remember, and is actually one of the reasons why I wrote my book, The New Jim Crow, in the first place, is that many people of color don't know or fully understand how this system of mass incarceration was constructed, why, and the devastating consequences for our communities. And the Clintons, you know, had you know, an important role. They escalated the drug war and the Get Tough movement far beyond what the Republicans had done, while at the same time dismantling the federal social safety net and transferring billions of dollars away from child welfare and housing into a prison building boom unlike anything the world had ever seen. And really the election of Bill...
Let's look at this and see whether or not Bill Clinton was just doing what was politically feasible. Right? Or if he was making a calculated choice for what benefited him politically. And what you came away with, you had a very good comparison in there about, like, you know, racism and if, you know, lunch counters or whatever. And if you're choosing this path all the time, then, like, can you really say Republicans made me do it? Like, there are too many occasions of Bill Clinton doing stuff on his own to say Republicans made me do it. So, like, tell me a little bit more about that, because that's what we get.
Yeah, so every time you come after the Clintons with this argument, you say, well, look at the growth of prisons, look at the end of welfare, look at what happened. There's a very strong defense that is made that I think is worth taking very, very seriously. And the defense is, well, look, you are just an unrealistic idealist. You don't understand the pragmatic necessities of politics, which is that Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton, they're good people trying hard, but they have to make compromises because politics is about compromises. And so I wanted to actually be very fair to that thesis, right? To take that thesis seriously and say, well, how would we know whether they were deliberately disregarding the interests of black voters, or whether they cared about the interests of black voters but were being forced into these kind of compromises. And what I want, and the way I think you evaluate that question is you say, well, look what happens when there are moments where you don't have to make a compromise, but it's not necessarily doing anything for you, right? So I wanted to try and figure out how we can tell which one of these things is, in fact, true. And so, when you look at it, you find that defense of the Clintons falls apart completely. And one of the reasons it falls apart completely is because in the 1992 campaign, Bill Clinton comes to prominence by doing something that no Democrat had done before, which is deliberately, from the very start, throwing traditional black political interests under the bus. Right, by having what was called the Sister Soldier moment, in which he prominently denounced, a black recording artist, by running on a tough on crime platform. The cover of the book, which I think represents this so well, is this picture that was taken at Stone Mountain in Georgia, the birthplace of the Klan, which is where Bill Clinton went for this photo opportunity in 1992, where he stood in front of a row of black prisoners with some Southern Democrat congressmen in order to show that he would be tough on crime. And in fact, his opponents in the Democratic primary at the time criticized him, said Bill Clinton was running on the platform, I'm going to lock him up, I'm going to keep white America safe. Well, that is not something that he's forced to do by Republicans. That is not a forced compromise. What that is an act of opportunism, deliberately realizing that there was political capital to be gained from hurting black interests and being willing to exploit that.
It's funny, when I look at it, I see, this is what I see. When you actually look at it, I see like black culture versus black policy. And so what Bill Clinton did is just like, playing the saxophone. He's into black culture. You mentioned that book about in your book, you mentioned the book, there's this book of journalists, and I have that book too, where they talk about how wonderful he is. And Donna Brazile, Donna Brazile had her own controversy as of late. But she says, when I was behind Bill Clinton in the line, in the food line at some fundraiser or another, or something like that, she says, he got the black-eyed peas. As if, like, he was black just by the sheer fact that he was adopting black culture on some level. Yeah. And you really go into, like, Toni Morrison saying, I know she's backpedaled since then, but I mean saying that he's the first black president. And it's because he eats McDonald's and because he has, he comes from poverty. And it's like, you have to ask yourself, I ask myself as a black person, is this how we self-identify?
Yes.
Yeah. And so part of the problem that I have is the way in which he used black culture, and the way in which he asserted people and black people in high places, but actually actively went against the interest of black people, of ordinary working class black people. And one of the things that I want to ask you, like, there were a lot of things in the book that I didn't know, right? In terms of like prisoners not being able to sue necessarily, and over certain things. And
Prison Litigation Reform Act, which took
yes,
away a lot of their previous rights.
And losing their right to to education. So like what I want to ask you, like when you were doing your research, what did you come across that surprised you the most, or did you know most of what was in there?
Well, first, just to go back quickly to that point about culture versus politics, because I think that's really interesting. That book, Dwayne Wickham's Bill Clinton and Black America, is a series of interviews with black elites, with people who were journalists, who were prominent clergy members, who were community leaders, who all love Bill Clinton. The book is very positive about Bill Clinton, and it's all about Bill Clinton seemed to know how to talk. He knew how to get along with people. And I think that there was a very deliberate strategy on Bill Clinton's part. There's a class element to it, too, where Bill Clinton realized that if he placated certain members of the black elite through patronizing cultural institutions, then he would have a lot of political capital that he could use to disregard the interests of the large bulk of the black working class. And so there's this class thing where people in the upper middle class were happy because they got invited to the White House, and Bill Clinton deliberately cultivated this at the same time as he put more people in prison than any other president before him. As you say, things that were surprising. I mean, there are a lot of little things I think that are surprising. One of there are things all throughout. I didn't realize that he gave a speech. He went to a black church during his presidency, and he gave a speech about how disappointed Martin Luther King would be if he were alive today. And he sort of takes on the voice of Martin Luther King and condemns absent black fathers. And now this is something that I think is just like, even Bill Cosby got a lot of criticism for his pound cake speech for doing. Bill Clinton went way beyond that in this Martin Luther King speech, and didn't receive much flack from it. Right, even though it's a truly racist and horrible speech, when you look at the remarks he actually made, they're horrendous. Yeah. When he said things like when he said to Ted Kennedy about Barack Obama, he said a few years ago, this guy would have been carrying our bags. There are things that are just at a level of extreme that I think are totally unappreciated. Which is the degree of his callousness and the sheer degree of his willingness to be manipulative and to hurt people. So some of the extent of what happened in Haiti and Rwanda, I didn't realize until I did, and also the extent to which Bill Clinton was being dishonest about how much he knew about the Rwanda genocide. When you go back into the press accounts of the time, he says he didn't understand the full extent of it. There are newspaper editorials every day in 1994 saying, Bill Clinton, you don't care about black lives. And he tries to cover that up retrospectively. And when you go back and you see the extent of the opposition that existed at the time, the things that Jesse Jackson was saying about criminal justice policy, those things make the defenses he now makes, they make it the more difficult to maintain, because this constant effort to rewrite history to say, well, it may look bad from where you stand now, but back then it made sense. Yeah. What I want people to understand is it didn't make sense even back then. People were calling him out even back then.
Yeah, this whole narrative that hindsight is 2020. Yeah. And I just want to, I just want to drill down on something else that you said about, Stone Mountain and him going to Stone Mountain. He wasn't there alone. Like, there was this whole plan. The thing that we don't tend to understand is that there was a whole plan by these, so-called centrist Democrats, including Southern Democrats, to kind of peel off white votes by kind of abandoning the base of which was black people. Black people were based on the Democratic Party. We're gonna appeal to white voters by distancing ourselves and showing that we can be tough on black crime. And I just want to read one thing in your book about Stone Mountain. It said, I kind of it's kind of amazing to me. In terms of, you talk about the DLC, and you talk about the Stone Mountain Correctional Institute, And, you know, if you say for a clutch of white politicians to pose in front of black inmates would be mildly nauseating in the most innocuous of locales. That Clinton did it with a pair of open bigots at the entrance to the Confederate Rushmore should violently churn the stomach. Okay? These are people like even at, like you point out later, even at the governor's mansion when he was governor of Arkansas, there were black people, black prisoners who came there to work for free.
Yeah.
And
yes.
so here you are again, just this photograph, which I tried to find the photograph earlier and couldn't find it. I couldn't find the photograph at first. You have him in front of these inmates basically showing, I'm going to be tough on black people. I'm going to be tougher than Republicans on black people. So, I mean,
It fails to tell the truth about our political system and its true winners and losers. The spectacle of large majorities of black folks supporting Hillary Clinton in the primary races ought to be proof enough. She said, I can't believe Hillary would be coasting into the primaries with her current margin of black support if most people knew how much damage the Clintons have done, the millions of families that were destroyed the last time they were in the White House, thanks to their boastful embrace of the mass incarceration machine and their total capitulation to the right-wing narrative on race, crime, welfare, and taxes. Governor Cunyon.
Life sentence for most people, especially black men, because once you go to prison, you are pretty much wiped out from society. You have a very difficult time of getting back into the job market. It's very difficult to get an education. There are a lot of places you can't live, a lot of things you can't do. So basically you have been destroyed socially as a result of having been caught up in this system. Now, this has a spillover effect on the black community that's been huge. It's absolutely destroyed the sociological ecosystem of the black community. It's broken down the black family unlike anything you can ever imagine. When you're incarcerating so many parents, you cannot expect the children to grow up normal. The war on drugs, I talked to Michelle Alexander, the author of The New Jim Crow, recently. We text back and forth periodically, and one of the things that Michelle and I agreed upon, she wrote an article about it as well, is that there should actually, if you want to talk about a reparations conversation, which I think the conversation should never go away, there should be reparations not just for slavery and for Jim Crow, but also for the war on drugs, which was a deliberate war on black people. You saw things like I know a guy who dealt some cocaine, but it was a first-time nonviolent offense. He didn't kill anybody. He didn't have any murders on his record anyway. And they took him down on a conspiracy charge. They incarcerated him. They gave him 15 life sentences. They incarcerated his mother, his sister, and his brother. His name was Mario Lloyd. He was out of Chicago. And the interesting thing is that his children suffered the consequences of the fact that they didn't have parents anymore. Now, it doesn't mean that what they did was okay. I mean, you know, it's not okay to sell drugs. We know that. But it also begs the question of whether or not the punishment fits the crime. That's the issue. The issue is not whether or not people that go to prison have broken the law. The fact is, a lot of people break the law. George W. Bush broke the law many, many times. He used cocaine. He was an alcoholic and got into drunk driving accidents. He did do a lot of things that were illegal over the course of his life, but he never did the kind of prison time he would have done as a black man. That's why I wrote my book, What If George Bush Were a Black Man?, to really highlight the hypocrisy that exists in our society, where you have a small margin of error for black men, where we make one tiny mistake at an early age. You break the law at the age of 17, somebody wants to lock you up and throw away the key. But with the little white kid, when he goes into the court of law, the judge is more sympathetic. They say, well, you know, he did something wrong and he should be punished, but he's got his whole future ahead of him, and as long as he serves his sentence, he can go on about his life and he's going to be okay. The other farce with the whole war on drugs was that the United States actually wasn't really fighting the war on drugs. That's why it didn't work. They were actually letting cocaine be imported from Central America by the boatload, by these drug dealers literally bringing in thousands. I mean, they were negotiating with these cartels in Central America so they could fight an illegal war with the Contras in Nicaragua. So they pretty much allowed them only to bring their drugs into black communities. So what they were doing was they were letting the drugs in through the front door, and to give the perception that they were fighting the war on drugs, they were locking up tons and tons of black men by the boatload. But black people were looking around like, where did all this cocaine come from? Where did this crack epidemic come from? We don't make crack in our neighborhood. Somebody's bringing this in here. We don't make AK-47s in our neighborhood. Somebody's bringing these in here. Well, people were making money by commodifying the black family and commodifying the black male and commodifying the black community. That's what they were doing. They were getting rich off of us by basically running our men through the mill like KFC chickens. So now you built this bloated, massive prison industrial complex. It only worsened, and this is where I get to the first black president, Bill Clinton. He wasn't no damn first black president. Never let anybody tell you Bill Clinton was the first black president. I was annoyed when people used to say that. The man ain't black. He's not a bad man, but he ain't black, and he certainly didn't help the black community, at least when it comes to incarceration. And Bill Clinton himself has admitted that he incarcerated too many black people back in the 1990s with his 3 strikes law. Basically, among other things, he did other things as well, mandatory minimums, things like that. I want to make sure I get that right, but I know that there was the Sentence Reform Act in the 1980s. And I think that might have established the mandatory minimums. But I know that Bill Clinton pushed forward with the 3 strikes law and did some other things that led to massive amounts of incarceration. And so here's the thing. So now that Hillary's coming back to the black community begging for votes, she's going to be in your church tap dancing and eating fried chicken and telling you how much she loves you and how much she loves Anita Baker and Patti LaBelle and all this, so that you will become, once again embrace her and vote for her. That's what they do with black people. They don't respond to us as an intelligent voting bloc. They respond to us as an emotional voting bloc. That if you get black people to like you emotionally, they'll come out and support you. Also, you have to scare black people. You scare them by telling them that the Republicans are so racist that the Republicans are going to put you back in chains. They're going to destroy you. So you got to vote for Democrats because we'll protect you. That's a form of bullying, almost like a mob boss. A mob boss does that too. He says, look, pay me for protection, or when these other people get a hold of you, you're done. Or good cop, bad cop. You better give me what I want, because if this guy gets a hold of you, you're going to be done. And I think that you have to be thoughtful about sort of falling for these sorts of tactics, because they're used repeatedly and they're absolutely ignorant. But they work. They work on a lot of people, and that's why they keep doing it. Another thing,
in order to kind of win votes.
Yeah, so this is I think one of the most disturbing, but it's very illustrative, right? Because it's a good case study of how Bill Clinton works. Ricky Ray Rector is a young man in Arkansas who commits a horrific crime. He murders one person, then he murders a police officer, but then he tries to commit suicide. And the court is trying to commit suicide. He shoots out a huge part of his brain and essentially lobotomizes himself. Essentially turns himself into a mental child. He's got the age of a 5 to 7 year old. And so there's this, and Ricky Ray Rector is scheduled for execution at the same time as Bill Clinton is running in the New Hampshire primary. Now, Bill Clinton is the governor of Arkansas at this point, and there is a huge amount of pressure brought on Bill Clinton not to execute this man because he's essentially a child. And a lot of civil rights groups are looking at Bill Clinton to see what he's going to do, because to execute someone who is essentially a child is seen as just so barbaric, something just so far beyond what any Democrat should be willing to perpetrate. I mean, the point is made by some commentators. If a Republican did this, Democrats would hound them to the ends of the earth over it, because you don't. One of the things is, we're queasy about the death penalty generally, but the idea of executing people with the most severe mental disabilities is just morally horrendous. Well, Bill Clinton, not only does he go through with it, and not only does he oversee the execution, but he flies back to Arkansas from the campaign trail so that he can be seen in Arkansas by the press when he's doing it, because he realizes that it's an opportunity to see him tough on crime, to distinguish himself from other Democrats as, well,
their budget and what they're proposing. Romney wants to he said in the first 100 days, he's going to let the big banks once again write their own rules. Unchain Wall Street. They're going to put you all back in chains. He said he's going to do nothing about stopping the
time. Bobby Rush, member of Congress, said the other day, I'm ashamed that I voted for the '94 crime bill. You ashamed of that bill?
Not at all. And in fact, I drafted the bill, as you remember.
I know that.
And by the way, we talk about this mostly in terms of Black Lives Matter. Black lives really do matter. But the problem is institutional racism in America. That's the overarching problem that still exists. and we should be talking about it. And you look at it, the legacy of racism in housing and jobs and so on. So, but having said that, if you take a look at the crime bill, of the money in the crime bill, the vast majority went to reducing sentences, diverting people from going to jail for drug offenses into what I came up with, the drug courts, providing for boot camps instead of sending people to prison so you didn't relearn whatever the bad thing that, you know, got you there in the first place. Put 100,000 cops in the street. When community policing was working, neighborhoods were not only safer, but they were more harmonious. And when the reason why the cops originally opposed my 100,000 cops for this community policing piece is because it's high intensive, and it means they got to get out of their cars. So they literally got out of their cars and learned who owned the local drugstore, the local neighborhood bar, whatever. And they were engaged in the neighborhood, which built confidence so that the woman, the African-American woman living in a corner alone where the drug deal's going down in front of her house knows she literally used to have your phone number as a cop. She'd call you and say, John.
Chairman, let me start out with this. I am ashamed of my vote. I sincerely apologize to my God, I apologize to my community, to my family. That was the worst vote, as I look back over the years, that I've taken since I've been in the Congress. It was a vote that really was accompanied with a lot of hope that we will finally be able to deal with not only the issue of crime in our community, devastating crime, but that we will also be able to do those things and have those programs and policies to deal with the other kinds of issues, the other problems in our community. And what happened with the crime bill and its implementation was that there was too much of a focus, too many resources on locking them up, but no resources on love and compassion. And as a result, we have devastated our communities, devastated our families, devastated our futures. And you can compare what happened with the crime bill and with the reaction. Well, let me just say this. Crack cocaine and the crime bill were the two worst issues, problems, catastrophes that the black community has suffered through in the last 50 years. I absolutely apologize for voting for that bill. I repudiate not the spirit, but the details of that bill. We have not accomplished anything other than further destruction of our communities.
You don't have to raise your hands. I do not blame you for wanting a female president. But that's a wicked woman. Now listen, you can vote for her, but vote for her with knowledge. She can be sweet, but so can you. And you know when you're sweet but playing a game. All of a sudden she know about Trayvon Martin. All of a sudden. The boy been dead nearly 2 years. Now she's talking about him like she met the mother and these white people, this is Satan. and you fall for that crap. Most of you that went to jail for having a little blunt in your pocket, they arranged that, the Clintons. Mass incarceration came about under the Clintons. Don't forget that. They call my young gangbangers super predators. And Black Lives Matter put it to her. She didn't know how to handle that. Call you a super predator that has no conscience, no sensitivity, like you a dog, you an animal. We got to bring you to heel. You, my young brothers, this is what she said about you. And she didn't just say it. It became law and policy of the U.S. government under Bill Clinton and her wife, his wife, and now she's apologizing. But apologizing can't bring back the broken families. Apologizing can't bring back those that have been destroyed in prison life. Apologizing! She, in her person, orchestrated the destruction of Libya and the killing of Muammar Gaddafi.
The fourth challenge is to take back our streets from crime, gangs, and drugs. And we have actually been making progress on this count as a nation because of what local law enforcement officials are doing, because of what citizens and neighborhood patrols are doing. We're making some progress. Much of it is related to the initiative called community policing, because we have finally gotten more police officers on the street. That was one of the goals that the president had when he pushed the crime bill that was passed in 1994. He promised 100,000 police. We're moving in that direction, but we can see it already makes a difference, because if we have more police interacting with people, having them on the streets, we can prevent crimes. We can prevent petty crimes from turning into something worse. But we also have to have an organized effort against gangs, just as in a previous generation we had an organized effort against the mob. We need to take these people on. They are often connected to big drug cartels. They are not just gangs of kids anymore. They are often the kinds of kids that are called super predators. No conscience, no empathy. We can talk about why they ended up that way, but first we have to bring them to heel. And the president has asked the FBI to launch a very concerted effort against gangs everywhere. In addition to that,
I don't know. You know, everybody got their own choice, you know. There's no telling what she's telling them or doing for them.
Finally, we're getting somewhere. Anybody else?
I said tonight that part of the blame should have been in terms of incarceration on the 1994 Clinton crime bill. A very cheap shot was thrown to me by a PhD who said that's sexist. I said absolutely it's not. If you're going to name a policy that you didn't like about Bush and you're going to put his name on it, you must put Clinton's policy, his name on that policy. Clinton knew what he was doing. He did it anyway. Sanders was one of the only people who stood on the floor at that time and said this is going to disproportionately affect black people. So black people, if you didn't know about Sanders before now, know about him now. Don't vote against your best interests. Your best interests are with the person that is talking about the values that you've been hearing about all your life. Your parents have been telling you about Dr. King all your life. Dr. King cared about poor people's rights. He cared about workers' rights. He cared about fair and equitable treatment in terms of hospitalization with people. These are the things that we've learned in our legacy of black church and our legacy of black liberation and black organizing. This is the person you should be supporting. If you are familiar with this book or you're familiar with that 1994 crime bill, which sent many of my friends away, she is not the candidate you should be voting for.
Senator left office in 2001. The United States had the highest rate of incarceration in the world. Human Rights Watch reported that in 7 states, African Americans constituted 80 to 90% of all drug offenders sent to prison, even though they were no more likely than whites to use or sell illegal drugs. By the way, studies since then have borne that out in every instance. Prison admission for drug offenses reached a level in 2000 for African Americans more than 26 times the level in 1983. All of the presidents since 1980 have contributed to mass incarceration. But as Equal Justice Initiative founder Brian Stevenson recently observed, President Clinton's tenure was the worst.
One unusual aspect of living in the Arkansas governor's mansion was getting to know prison inmates who were assigned to work in the house and the yard. When we moved in, I was told that using prison labor at the governor's mansion was a long-standing tradition that kept down costs, and I was assured that the inmates were carefully screened. Now, I had defended several clients in criminal cases, but seeing them in jail or in court was not the same as encountering a convicted murderer in the kitchen every morning. I was apprehensive, but I agreed to abide by tradition until I had a chance to see for myself. I learned a lot as I got to know the inmates better. We enforced the rules strictly and sent back to prison any inmate who broke one.
About, Hillary Clinton, back 20 years, 30 years ago, was using a lot of prison labor, black prison labor, when she was the first lady of Arkansas. I don't have a lot to say about it other than the fact that, I've never liked the Clinton family. I've always felt that there was just an unfair exchange in terms of the fact that I don't feel that there was unique or genuine reciprocity in the relationship. I think that for black people, we're kind of in an era where we're starting to find ourselves, and I think that when you start finding yourself, white supremacists get uncomfortable because they're used to the pimp game. They're used to basically controlling your behavior and benefiting from you without necessarily showing fair reciprocity. So, I'm not surprised that Hillary used prison labor. I think that, seeing Hillary kind of as the mistress on the plantation, is kind of accurate. I think she reminds me of those white folks that that claim that they're your friend, but really they're not. And they claim that they're your friend, or they believe, in fact, in their mind, they believe that they're your friend because they're treating you better than the abuser was treating you. So it's almost like a woman who has a boyfriend who says, well, yeah, I ignore you and I cheat on you, but the other guy, he used to beat you, so I'm protecting you from the other person. So in a way, it's like the good pimp versus the bad pimp, but at the end of the day, they're all pimps.
Shop in Minneapolis, who asked Clinton about her super predator comments. The quiet back and forth ended with Clinton growing frustrated and telling the young woman, quote, well, why don't you go run for something then? Angela Davis, if you could respond, there's so many different things.
I think it's really wonderful that Black Lives Matter activists are participating in this electoral period in this way, forcing candidates to speak on issues about which they might not speak. And of course, Hillary Clinton should have said, well, I was wrong to use the term super predators. What I know now, I didn't necessarily know. Then there are many ways in which she could have disavowed it. And we know, of course, that the Clinton administration was responsible, at least in large part, for the buildup of what is now called mass incarceration with the passage of the 1994 crime bill. it seems to me that if she's interested in the votes of not only African Americans and people of color, but of all people who are progressive and attempting to speak out against the racism of over-incarceration, she would simply say, I was wrong then. That super predator is a racially coded term. It's so interesting that she tends to rely on a kind of universalism that prevents her from acknowledging the extent to which racism is so much a force and an influence in this country.
It does not matter that 96% of black women voted for Hillary Clinton.